Hello, it's your favorite shrimp. I am back. Um, so I was sent another map. These are very popular, as I said. Nimagan, however you want to pronounce that. That's how you pronounce it. Um, Sent me this map to look at. Nimagan, for context, has two ranked maps I saw. Probably a couple GDs that are ranked as well. And looking at it, I can see why you're ranked. Your ranked mapper. I struggled to find anything really worth talking about. Um, that being said, I did feel the map was pretty shallow, and so I was spending some time thinking about, okay, how can I approach that? How can I help in a way that's not like, you know, blah, uber subjective and like I don't like this map, kind of thing, right? So I think I found an angle. So in general, like you have some good ideas here and there. There's a few like mistakes I would uh, call them. For example, here you set up this triangle, and then you complete the triangle with something that's a part of a separate musical phrase. Um, so really, all of this should be probably part of the same thing. Um, so yeah, that was a little strange. All this was like, for the most part, fine. I ought to put this down here to kind of complete the pattern that you're setting up. And I thought this was really lame. Like this, like, you know, at the very least, kind of maybe increase the spacing a little bit more, go a little bit more ham. And then here, I would make this active, probably. And like put a spinner at the end here. So that there's a little bit more of a little bit of a jump, a little bit of a spike in intensity there for that vocal. Probably I would like look at like a 1/12 snapping or something like that to get it really snappy, kind of to fit that vocal phrase. But these are all relatively small things, right? This section here, I thought was a very basic way of mapping it. Because like ultimately you kind of just end up like using sliders everywhere, and it loses a lot of I think the nuance of what's going on. Particularly because like all the spacing's the same here. It's like a hard diff that you're mapping right now, which feels quite lame. Like this was cool, for example, but it's like basically the same pattern as this, and you haven't really spaced this far enough necessarily to get an actual difference in the movement. It's kind of like, oh wow, it's faster, but you don't actually really play it faster because it's not long enough or fast enough to actually result in that change. I'm also really not a fan of like the back-to-back 3/4 sliders. Like I would try to find a way to like do something like this. And I actually think that makes a lot more sense. And have that rhythm change happen with that really standout vocal, which you're trying to emphasize already with the SV, but it'd be even more impactful if you increase the spacing, if you increase the SV, and you also made the change in rhythm happen on this. Like a lot of these, like these are really cool sounds and really interesting sounds. I kind of wish it wasn't so passive. Like it's just so many sliders. A lot of the rhythms are exactly the same. Like this 3/4 slider into the 1/2 slider. It's like just a repeat over here, right? But the section is so different. And then it's different here, right? So ideally, I'd like to see a little bit more variation within these, something to make the interesting things, the standout things, actually fundamentally stand out in the actual map instead of just using the same rhythms everywhere. And, this is a common mistake with a lot of mappers, and especially ranked mappers. Ranked mappers make this mistake all the time. And in some cases, there's not much you can do about it. Like, there is no other option. It is what it is in that case. but 99% of the time there's something that you can do to either change the rhythm before, use additive rhythm if you need to, simplify the rhythms, use SVs or patterning to make them feel different if you absolutely have to, can't use the same rhythm, or have to use the same rhythm again. So I think you need to space this a lot more, because there's a relatively large rhythm gap here, but you don't have the sort of spacing necessary to make this slider feel epic. So you kind of want to make that more epic, spacing-wise. And there's like a high in the vocal phrase, but it's just a reflection of this slider. It's not terrible like it is, but maybe increasing the SV a little bit here would be good. Maybe decreasing the SV here so that you can get sort of that high pitch being felt a little bit more. So if I was going to throw an example, I kind of like the SV decrease on the first slider, so I'm going to try that. So let's see how that turns out. So something like that maybe, where it actually sort of feels that high pitch there. I would be thinking about something like that. This NC structure makes no sense here. So like, okay, this is a nice faster SV, but you need to space this way more, because otherwise it doesn't actually really get felt. This was a nice slowdown, I like that. And then you set up the 1/3 spacing to be like this, and then you kind of stack it. Like, just keep it the same spacing to be more epic. So I would do something like that, probably. Anyway, so this sort of introduces some more of my problems, where, again, a completely different section, completely different sounds in the song, but we're using the same rhythm and basically the same patterning as before, right? Now, in this time, we're using the parallel 1/2 sliders, which I don't really think that we used. Like, this is a little bit of a different movement compared to this, but fundamentally, this is sort of the same rhythm. It causes this section to feel kind of similar to the previous one. And it's not exactly the same by any means, but it's a very significant shift in the song. And we're going to see as we keep going that this problem doesn't really go away. It kind of is resulting in the entire map sort of feeling like there wasn't enough ideas and substance to them, to the map, because, you know, there's just not enough different varieties of rhythms and patterns being seen. Like here, for example, with the parallel sliders, but there was a very different vocal phrase compared to this. And like this one has like the instrumental hits on the tail, for example. So there's that. And this is a very different vocal phrase to this over here. So this one is a repeat of this over here, which makes actually perfect sense to me, because we think of the ABAC song structure that my first uploaded video talked in huge detail about, right? The first one is A, then there was B, and now we're A again. So it makes perfect sense that this is a repeat of that first measure. What doesn't make sense is that the second measure is a repeat, because the second measure is different in the song structure itself. And then now we're in C, so C is that transition measure, which leads us into the new hypermeasure after this, which is why it's so much more exaggerated here, much more emphasized. Which then we use the same exact pattern, even though this is like building up. It's way more intense here, but we're using the same pattern, which is really underwhelming. Now, you're building tension here by keeping it sort of low intensity here, which is nice, but it's ultimately the same pattern as this, right? So it doesn't stand out because it's the same pattern. And then over here, the section changes, so it's a little more intense. So, you know, here, as you can see, you changed sort of the orientation of it, which is nice. This was a better iteration of that change, because the rhythm was different. So there's that. And then now we're in this calm section. This part was like okay. This part, like, you're going from a held movement into another held movement. It really doesn't stand out. I would definitely be thinking about, you know, doing something more interesting movement-wise with this. Maybe a back and forth like this. Because you don't want to go held into another held. That's really lame. I think we need to figure out like a more consistent way of mapping that double drum hit as well. Because like the double drum hit was mapped with this like triangle, really messy triangle, but triangle. And then it was mapped with back and forth. And then it was originally mapped with the stack, right? And then it was mapped with like completely different rhythm here. And then a back and forth. And then this one's a triangle again. So I'd like to find a more consistent way in a stack of representing the same exact sound. And it doesn't have to be the same thing every single time. I'm not saying that. But when each of those instances are fundamentally different and there's no sense of progression, it doesn't really feel like it's representative of the song to some degree. Okay. Back to this rhythm here. We had this like really prominent like build up here, but this doesn't really feel like it's building up. It feels like it's building down. Kind of weird that way. I would like to see like maybe a significant increase in slider velocity here and see that really ramp up dramatically, because of the kick sliders. You don't really have to play it. It would just look cool. It doesn't actually like necessarily play like much. And then you have the explosion here. Well, not really an explosion here. The stopping it was here was fine too. But we're already having that stopped movement here. So it doesn't really feel like there's that much contrast here for this build-up. Because we go from stopped into very slow. This would be much more impactful if this was a really fast slider, like it was a really high energy section. Which would make sense for what the song is doing here. If you had a really high SV, you know, for example, if I was going to throw something together really fast, you know, I would maybe do like this. You know, a sort of an explosion of intensity here. And then you slowly pull it down as the song's pitch decreases. I think that would be a really cool thing. So let me just keep going with that. And you can adjust it, so maybe you would decrease it even faster than I did, so that each of these would sort of bump it up again, right? So maybe it's like 1.2, 0.6, 0.3, then it's 1, and then 0.6, 0.3, so on and so forth, right? Sort of show that progression and the pitch. Kind of like this, right? Where you scale the spacing and the SVs, which was nice. have no idea why this shape is here. I really dislike these random shapes in maps. That's me. They serve no purpose in my opinion. So we had like a nice idea here with the back and forths for this vocal phrase. And then we had like this, which was nice, a different type of movement. I like this. And then we had the back and forths come back. But then we didn't use that same movement as over here. So there was a, you had this, and then we kind of do this, which is okay, I guess. And then we use this, but the problem is that this movement, like this is a very circular movement. And then we do that same sort of circular movement, and this time it's a little different, yes, but it's kind of sort of fundamentally the same triangle shape pattern. And the same thing with like here, like this is a back and forth pattern, but the back and forth pattern happens before the section happens, right? Before that back and forth pattern. So the ideas that you're using for specific sounds, they're not being respected. Sort of the integrity of that idea is not being respected. You're not allowing that idea to solely represent the one thing. It's sort of permeating throughout all these other ideas and sections. And it's really muddling the water of the representation of your ability to connect and tie those patterns, those ideas, to elements in the song, because those elements are sort of haphazardly and inconsistently used. So I'm going to keep going, see if I can find more. So, this sort of triangle spiraling idea here. Used here, here, here. Looks like this one was pretty egregious, right? It's basically a triangle. So that's fine. And then now we're into the sort of the drop. Like this is the most standout part, and like this kind of patterning feels really lame for this intensity, right? This is a cool section, but we're just sort of spamming parallel sliders. I don't know, it feels kind of lame. I feel like we could have had a more interesting idea here. Here, so you have like the parallel sliders for these two sounds. I would really be careful about what you're trying to emphasize, because like your NCing tells me that you're emphasizing this, but then your patterning tells me that, you know, by the fact that you have the repetition, tells me you're trying to represent like these two things together as one grouping. But you kind of are putting a lot of the emphasis on this slider here, which is a little strange. And then this fast slider, fast 3/4 slider, into a fast 3/4 slider, into a fast 3/4 slider. Yeah, there's a direction change, but there was also direction changes like over here. There was direction changes here. So it's like, again, the things that are standing out, like nothing's particularly standing out to me, right? I actually thought this was the most standout thing. You know, if I go back here. Like, this to me stood out way more than this, because it's a significant break from, a significant change from these two 1/2 parallels. You had this longer slider that was a 90-degree shift on the axis, so that stood out quite a bit. It was also a break away from the repetition here. So this pattern, or this slider, stands out a lot. And then you have this, which is literally the new measure, but it's really underwhelming as a result. So perhaps changing the rhythm here, or changing the SV to be significantly slower, or whatever it is different from this. But currently it kind of all plays together. And, yeah. This linear, really low spacing felt strange. So perhaps kind of keeping up that intensity would be good. because it's a very intense part, so it doesn't really make sense to like bring that spacing down, the intensity down so much there. It has a lot of contrast, but there's not really anything worth emphasizing, right? The next thing there is emphasis worth. It's sort of the entire phrase is kind of grouped together by the rhythms, but then you have that really weird emphasis shift. So I'd probably do something like that. And then like here, for example, you have this big spike in intensity, the movement for this loud vocal, but then you bring the movement out, right? So you have lots of cursor pacing here, cursor momentum comes here, and then the cursor momentum has to be taken out significantly, which is weird given that this is all representing one held vocal phrase. There's not really anything here signaling that there's a lot of emphasis being warranted there, such that there's such a significant momentum change, which has, of course, emphasis. And then, of course, you have that increase in momentum here, which kind of makes sense given that there's a relatively loud instrumental there. But it doesn't necessarily represent the entire held vocal. And then we're going into here. This patterning probably looks a little familiar, right? Given that it was the same as, what was it? Right here, right? So we had this, 120-degree rotations idea going on, and we have the same thing going on. Same thing over here, right? But a completely different section, completely different feeling. It's much calmer and smoother here instead of sort of staccato, like the folk kind of idea. Much smoother here. But the patterning and the rhythms are the same, right? So where's the contrast, really, right? This also felt really intense for what the song was giving, and it's limiting your ability to create contrast from the more intense part of the chorus over here, where the vocals are really going off. And it's also limiting your ability to get that build-up going, right? So as the section over here progresses, sort of every subsequent measure, it rises in pitch. So because the SV is so high, and you are increasing... Yeah, so you are increasing the SV slightly, but like 0.1 times. But it's just not noticeable because you already started so high. Because you started high, going a little bit higher doesn't really mean much. But if you start low, well then you can work your way up and it's going to stand out way more. And so, here the climax happens, and there's not really any impact, because it's the same SV. SV didn't change here. The slowdown here is nice. Probably some more circles in the outro here would be good, because there's a lot of really prominent, defined vocals that are being mapped over. But that's okay. The outro was kind of okay. But hopefully this makes sense. Really, ultimately, and this is a perfectly rankable map, but really I would have liked to see respecting your ideas more, the ones that you do have, and allowing them to represent individual things. Now, for example, if I was going to show one of my maps that I did this, just because it's easy, I wing all of my videos, if you haven't figured that out yet. So, oftentimes going to my maps is the easiest, because I don't have to think about it. One thing that I did really well in this is that I had a very prominent idea for the vocal phrase of the chorus, which you can see here. So it's a very prominent vocal phrase, But what's so critical about that is that I didn't do that pattern anywhere else, right? Nowhere else unless it was supposed to be related to that core idea. Like if I go to the chorus, it's the same thing every single time. Well, actually, this time it was a little bit different rhythm-wise because the song's different. But what it allows you to do is, like, as the song progresses, right? So here's, the second chorus. There's this, right? And the last one, I can do this, where there's a new snare that wasn't, or cymbal crash that wasn't there before, right? Only the first one has the cymbal crash, and on this one, all three of them do. So I was able to make the spacing bigger and simplify the rhythm a little bit. I didn't have the red tech rhythms here, and it makes it stand out. And then moving into this one, I was able to break apart the pattern because I was so rigidly consistent. I was able to break apart the pattern over here to really have that emotional payoff at the end of the song as the vocals reach their maximum climax, which is of course signified by the color hexing in the red, which is the only time I use that color. But that kind of like emotional payoff doesn't work unless you're rigidly consistent and you pre-plan your developments, right? Like I planned that from the very beginning to have that payoff. But it only works because I used that 120-degree triangle rotations only for that vocal phrase on the entire map. If you look through the map, you will not find that used again. So that's something to keep in mind is you can't really get that if you map the way you did in your map. And I'm happy to go through my map in more detail. I don't want to drag on this video even longer. But yeah, that's something to consider, and hopefully this makes sense to you. If you have any questions, shoot me a message. Yeah, cheers. It's as simple as that.